take you through the evidence step by step.
The pilot of Brian Williams' helicopter will join us.
We will be hearing from two pilots.
You have a map tonight. Tell us what we're seeing here.
Brian Williams did an interview with Stars and Stripes.
I talked to a soldier last night.
Let's talk about this now with our media experts.
Our media panel is here.
What does this mean for the industry?
Did he lie?
How bad is the damage to his credibility?
The media is on it! Now, this may seem like overkill, but for me, no, it's not overkill because I am happy. Finally, someone is being held to account for misleading America about the Iraq War.
That's the Daily Show's Jon Stewart poking fun at the US media's coverage of the Brian Williams controversy. Stewart saying the American press should have applied the same scrutiny to the Bush administration before the US invasion of Iraq. We continue our conversation now with Richard Fowler. He's an American radio host and political activist. Also with us, Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent of Features Story News. Gentlemen, thanks so much. Now, let's widen this out because there's a very serious issue despite the comedy we just saw from Jon Stewart there. Richard, you know, we've seen this tendency of the American media establishment to basically be spoon-fed news, and we saw that most in the run-up to the Iraq War. Have they learned any lessons, or is it still going on?
Well, you know, I got to tell you, I think that is a I think Jon Stewart's 100% right on this one. The fact that the media literally took everything the Bush administration said without any scrutiny, looking into the evidence, doing in-depth reporting about what was really happening in Iraq, and there was really no weapons of mass destruction. And the question is do we live in an era today where the media does the same thing? And, you know, I'm not really sure. I think the jury is still out. What was happening with ISIS and ISIL, and how, you know, there's sort of this full-throated, we need to destroy them and bomb them beyond belief.
You see similarities, right, Simon? Do you see that with a sort of reaction to ISIL and the lead-up to the Iraq War?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is not just an American media issue. I think this goes beyond national boundaries. I think the media is very bad at saying sorry. I noticed that just a couple of weeks ago, the editor of the New York Times was asked recently how he felt that his newspaper had performed during the lead-up to the Iraq War, and of course they had Judith Miller, then a correspondent for the New York Times, promulgating the theory that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, some would argue, in a way that had been spoon-fed by the Bush administration. And he said, you know, on balance, reflecting, I think we did pretty well. I mean, that is not a rational, there's self-delusion going on there, and you would be much straighter with your readers and your subscribers and your viewers and listeners if you said, actually, we really messed that up.
Where does this delusion come from, Richard? Because I covered the lead-up to the Iraq War at the United Nations, and I thought I was going mad because you get the reports from Hans Blix and Mohammed al-Baradei, the experts, and saying there is no evidence, and then you would get this stuff in the press saying, oh, this is happening, this is happening. How does this happen, and how do we push back against it as an industry?
Well, I think it becomes like sort of having a real, you know, looking at the man in the mirror, as Michael Jackson would say, right? And having an honest conversation with ourselves. And I think that is why you've seen this explosion of media sources that aren't your traditional brass conglomerate media, i.e. YouTube. Our shows on YouTube are part of the Young Turks Network. And we believe on our show about having real, honest conversations with our listeners. And when we don't have an honest conversation, guess what? They're allowed to comment on the video. They're allowed to video respond to what we're saying. And so that allows us to really not only we're held accountable to a viewer that's closer than a viewer on a regular cable network who sort of it's a two-dimensional view. We think our, you know, YouTube and the new forms of media are three-dimensional, right? You're interacting a lot more, and I think that's why you're seeing this explosion, because people are tired of, you know, more of the same, more of we're going to go to war just because the media says they've agreed with the, you know, the leading class and say it's okay for us to do it.
Resisting the drumbeat.
All of which is terrific, but you can't have any of those conversations if driving the conversation is not the promulgation of facts by journalists on the ground engaged in continuing serious understanding and analysis of what's taking place. And what we've seen over the last 20 years here in the US, on the part particularly of the US television networks, is a continuing diminution in serious global coverage. And that's a problem.
You train a lot of young American journalists going into TV. Have you noticed a generational shift in terms of the craft?
Well, yeah, I mean, in two different ways. I mean, on the one hand, there's a huge generational shift for the positive because people are now emerging from journalism schools digitally articulate, right? So they can shoot, they can edit, they can blog, they can post videos to YouTube faster than I can boil a kettle, and that's all wonderful because it creates the environment for more information to get out there through more channels. But I do think that the rigor, the journalistic rigor that we all grew up with 30, 40 years ago is under pressure in a way that it hasn't been before. And the challenge for some of these new brands, it's quite, in a way, inspiring to see some of the work that, for example, Vice News is doing on the ground in various parts of the world, Ukraine particularly. You are seeing, I think, some glimmers of hope there that there's serious journalism taking place.
But Richard, new media isn't always held up to the same standards as old media. I mean, you talk about Vice, but there's been some problems with Vice in terms of their sourcing, with ISIL, for example, were they in the pocket of ISIL? BuzzFeed, you know, great reporting here in Washington, but listicles about cats and dogs that sort of dominate the internet. So, you know, where does this new responsibility lie, or is it becoming much more opaque?
Well, I think it's becoming much more opaque, and it's becoming more. This is for this one time around, right? In this new sort of as media begins to expand, it's less about sort of pleasing the critics and the top brass, and more about pleasing the audience directly, right? Because even in the sort of race, this fight to the finish for ratings, ratings are only about pleasing advertisers. Because you want to show an advertiser that, you know, when they put on their ad, whether it be a toothpaste ad or an ad for Cialis, that they're going to get a bang for their buck.
But that's as true on Facebook as it is on NBC.
Yeah, but there's a distinction in ad placement, right? So on YouTube, the ads, I mean, I'm not going out there looking for advertising. YouTube is selling ads on my programming, and they can sell ads on all the news and the vertical and the formulas are a lot different, which allows me to have a real and honest conversation with my audience. And even if I decide that, you know, and YouTube, a lot of YouTube stars have endorsed products. I'm like, listen, I'm endorsing this product because I need to pay my bills. Now back to the real news, exactly how I believe it is. And I think that is the distinction, and that is why, you know, the integrity is sort of, I guess, twisted a little bit is the right word. And I don't think it's on it. I don't think it lacks integrity, but I think the integrity has been shifted to a new audience.
What about the way in which journalists receive news now? You know, the White House has said it's the most transparent White House in a long time, and there are a lot of journalists in this town who think they are spoon-fed the news, it's hyper-secretive, and they are basically being conned on a daily basis.
And as I was intimating earlier, the most powerful office within the communications department of the White House right now is the social media office, far more powerful and important in the daily grind than the press office and the briefings presided over by Josh Earnest. And in fact, you're seeing now these things being amalgamated in one larger office because the White House has understood that it has a way of getting its message out to members of the public in a very unfiltered way. If you talk to a YouTube sensation who's got 8.2 million subscribers, first of all, you're going to reach 8.2 million people the minute she puts that video out on Twitter. Secondly, she's unlikely to ask you the same kind of tough questions that a George Stephanopoulos is going to ask you. She's not used to the format of a presidential interview. It's a very, very radically different proposition, very attractive to the policymaker.
But I beg to differ on that for a couple of reasons. One, I think that if you look at the YouTube interviews, I think they asked tough questions. They didn't ask it in the way that somebody sitting in the briefing room would ask it, but they asked the tough questions. They asked about Cuba. They asked about ISIS. And I think, you know, they also, and somebody who does YouTube reporting, I have no problem asking the tough questions at the State of the Union. I'll ask the tough questions to the members of Congress, but I think it's a different format, and I think it's a battle between, you know, what seems to be the old way of doing things and a new way of doing things.
I agree with this battle thing, because it's very interesting. In the old days, we had the Walter Cronkite, who basically went to Vietnam and came back and said, this war is unwinnable, and changed the mind of the American people. Now we have Brian Williams lying about going to war. Are we not trusting the old figures of authority anymore? And if so, who do we trust? Do we trust Jon Stewart?
But I don't think you trust any single person anymore, and I think that's the radical difference that's occurred here. When Walter Cronkite came back from Vietnam and said what he was saying, Lyndon Johnson knew immediately, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. There is no single channel, no single network, no single website, social media platform that has that same sense of gravitas anymore because of this untrammeled universe of different sources. And what you're seeing at the broadcast networks is a real struggle. They'd love to retain that sense of importance and vitality in the American national conversation, but day by day they see that that's leaching away from them.
But I think that's a good thing, right? I think it's a great thing that it's not controlled by 3 or 4 people. I think you look at our broadcast news lineup, and thanks to Lester Holt, now it has a little bit of diversity, and it represents a little bit more of what America looks like. But if you think about what America looks like, population breakdown, if you think about the audience, right, which is why I think one reason why the top brasses are losing their way is that they have not adapted to the changing audience. And
America's
on top of
not
that,
just white Anglo-Saxon males anymore.
Not anymore.
Exactly.
And I think on top of that, because we're no longer a nation, I would say a world of, you know, this ideal of appointment television, that's the other reason why they've lost their audience and they've lost their will, because I can jump on at 3 o'clock in the morning, or I could jump on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and get the news that I need when I need to get it. And because of that, they haven't adopted as fast because, you know, once again, the conglomerates missed the fact that, you know, the train was moving and they were still standing on the platform. This is the problem they've created for themselves, and now they have to try to compete.
But there is a problem here, isn't there? That if everyone's offering different views and different opinions, where do we necessarily go for the truth? You know, the press used to hunt as a pack in the old days. You think of Watergate. Okay, Washington Post broke the story, but the entire press corps chased that story in this town. Monica Lewinsky, for example. When you have different viewers, different audiences to satisfy, can the media deliver on that public service job that you were saying at the outset of the show, Simon, considering all the different viewers that they have to please?
I think that this is an enormously problematic question, and I think that it puts an onus on the citizen. I think if you are a citizen and you want to be a responsible, globalized citizen participating in elections and acting democratically, the onus is now much more on you to determine where you're going to get your sources of news from than it was 30 years ago when it was either CBS, ABC or NBC and they were all pretty much doing the same program every night as one another. So I think that, you know, there's a message there to people that they have to figure out for themselves their way of navigating through this real, in a sense, digitally inspired anarchic chaos.
Richard, is the social media consumer that you appeal to ready to become that citizen? Final word.
Of course they are, because I think they, beyond watching the Richard Fowler show, they watch other programs, right? They watch BuzzFeed, they watch the New York Times. And what we do on our show is we try to make sure that we give them the story as we got it. This is where we got our story from. Here's my commentary on said story. And you could decide however you want to.
Richard Fowler, Simon and Marks, thank you very much. That's all we have time for. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter @CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.